Welcome to Acton Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you're going to find a link to subscribe directly to Acton Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you find fine podcast products. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. I'm joined today by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Noah Gould, alumni and student programs manager here at Acton. We're also joined today by a special guest, Jane Clark Scharl, who is a poet and playwright. Her work has appeared on the BBC and in many poetry journals on both sides of the Atlantic. Her verse play, Sonny Le Matina, opened in New York City in February 2023 and is available through Wiseblood Books. She's also the author of the essay Blood of a Thousand Christs, The Violent Faith of Cormac McCarthy, which appears in the summer 2023 issue of our magazine, Religion and Liberty. And we'll put a link to that essay in the show notes for this episode. This week, we'll discuss 3 of the major cases recently decided by the Supreme Court. But first, let's go to this essay on the late Cormac McCarthy, who I'll make the note. We talked briefly about Cormac McCarthy a couple weeks ago when we had Jonah Goldberg on the program right after he passed. And as the editor's note in the magazine indicates, Cormac McCarthy did pass away as this issue was going to print. So this was not planned as kind of a remembrance of Cormac McCarthy. The timing was just such as it was. So, Jane, I'll throw it open to you to tell me what you discovered, what you learned and found in reading through the works of Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today to talk about this. Cormac McCarthy is a very difficult writer to read en masse. I read through almost all of his books in about 2 months last winter in preparation for this essay. And it really was a bit of a harrowing experience. The 2 books I did not reread for this were Outer Dark and Child of God, because I just knew that those themes I didn't need to reacquaint myself with some of the themes in there. But I read everything else. And when you spend that much time with a single writer's work, you start to notice imaginative patterns that come up. And the pattern that I noticed, and I'm not the first one to have noticed this for sure, but it's also not as commonly observed as you might think. I noticed that almost every time McCarthy talks about religion or God, he's also talking about violence. So those 2 themes are inseparable in his imagination. The other thing I noticed is that within McCarthy's world, there doesn't appear to be true atheism. McCarthy gets labeled as an atheistic or nihilistic author, but when you actually read his books, that's not the tone that you see. His characters are not truly atheists, even the ones that describe themselves as atheists. They eventually find themselves admitting that they kind of think there is a God. They're just choosing not to believe in him. So the idea that God doesn't exist isn't a vibrant option in McCarthy's world. The real idea there is, we're pretty sure something is out there. The question is it something we want to be close to, or is God actually just a monster? So those were the 2 things that I wanted to play with in McCarthy's work, because I think people, when they think of him, they mostly think of him as violent. And I wanted to show that there is something else going on to do with faith in McCarthy's work.
Could you unpack that part, particularly for me? You do a good job of it in the essay, but for the listeners here, that I'm sure part of the harrowing experience is all of the violence that appears in his works. And I'm pretty sure that that's what gives way to a lot of people's interpretation of McCarthy as being nihilistic, is that it's just violence on top of violence, violence all the way down. What was your discovery? Where do you see God's presence even in that kind of violence, harrowing kind of violence that appears in McCarthy's work?
Sure. Just a quick note, part of the harrowing experience, the violence is part of it, but another part of it is how the plots tend to dissolve after a while, which sometimes you can read something that's very, very violent, but there's a thread of a plot pulling through it, and that gives the violence some meaning or some structure. And within Cormac, there almost always begins a plot, and then after a while, the plot just kind of goes away, and you're left with nothing but the violence. It's almost like the violence is this wave, and it drowns the plot. So that's part of it too. Is this structural collapse that you experience as you read through his books, and you get that more in some than in others, but it's pretty prevalent. So, and I think that's part of where the nihilism comes from. Is it's very easy to begin feeling like nothing matters because these plots are dissolving around you as you're trying to navigate the violence. So your question about where do we find God in that? You don't find a very clear theodicy. I don't think McCarthy is attempting to make some kind of really deep theodicy in his work. I think he's genuinely wrestling with that question of what do we do with the reality that something is out there, something made us, something brought all of this into being, and this is what it is. It's this violence, this blood, and then ultimately just death. And I think it's really difficult to give some kind of summary because Cormac McCarthy himself resists that. He never gave us anything like that. But there are a few incidents throughout the books that begin to crack away at what we might do with all this violence. So I think the clearest one is from The Crossing, which is in the trilogy that starts with All the Pretty Horses, which I think is a pretty commonly read McCarthy. And if anybody's looking for how to get into McCarthy, All the Pretty Horses is a great start. It's got a plot that runs all the way through. The main character doesn't die on the 5th page. It's got some more traditional narrative elements that make it easier to navigate All the Pretty Horses. So if you haven't read McCarthy, start with All the Pretty Horses and then go from there. But in The Crossing, there's this incident that I write about in the essay where a man's son has been killed in an earthquake, and the father moves into a church that's been damaged by the earthquake and is going to collapse. So the father moves in under this compromised vault and basically says to God, I'm going to sit here until you kill me with this vault, until it falls down and crushes me. And all the people in the village try to get the man to come out. The priest comes and speaks to him and tries to give him all these theological insights into grace and how God uses suffering and all this stuff in the man. And what Cormac writes is, and I might cry when I read this because I always cry. If you listen to me ever, I end up crying. So I apologize in advance. But this is what Cormac writes. He says, the priest spoke to this misguided man of the nature of God and of the spirit and the will and of the meaning of grace in men's lives. And the man heard him out and nodded his head at certain salient points. And when the priest was done, this old man raised his book aloft and shouted at the priest, you know nothing. This is what he shouted. And I think that's something we have all done, where someone has tried to come to us in suffering and give us reasons or some sort of rational comfort, and we've all nodded. And then in our hearts or out loud, we've said, you know nothing. And that's a moment that we need to acknowledge is part of human existence. And I think Cormac McCarthy is determined to make us face that moment and to implicate us in that moment. And it's not the end of the story in The Crossing. So the father isn't crushed by the vault. He lives there, and then he actually contracts an illness and dies before the vault comes down and crushes him. And he sees this almost as God's last laugh, that God won't even let him choose the manner of his death and won't even let him participate in his son's suffering by dying in the same manner as his son did. Here's what Cormac writes at the end. He says, at his dying, he had told the priest that he'd been wrong in his every reckoning of God, and yet had come at last to an understanding of him anyway. He said that his demands upon God remained intact and unspoken in even the simplest heart. But God needs no witness, neither to himself nor against. To God, every man is a heretic. So I think if you're looking for that theodicy or that Job moment in Cormac McCarthy, that's the clearest you're going to get. And it's pretty disturbing, but it's also, I think, pretty wise.
So there's an interesting, and this is a fascinating, absolutely fascinating piece, and I would commend all our listeners to read it. I got a lot out of it. I've read maybe a half dozen Cormac McCarthy novels, most of them many years ago, most of them when I was a young man. And one of the interesting things as I was reading your essay is exploring how Cormac McCarthy fits into the American literary landscape of his time. When I thought, when you have this potential for God's malevolence and for these plots that seem to vanish into thin air, I was reminded of the American science fiction author Philip K. Dick, in which both things frequently occur. And there's a short story called Faith of Our Fathers, in which the protagonist basically sees his way through the illusions of a totalitarian society and comes to confront the leader of this evil society, and only to discover that he's God and he cannot be thwarted. So you have similar strains in people like Dick. You have also, you pointed out in your essay that McCarthy seems predisposed more to engineers and scientists than to sort of fellow literary types. And here I thought of Kurt Vonnegut and Thomas Pynchon as analogs in that way. But then McCarthy is unique in this violence and in this sort of religious juxtaposition of violence. How do you see McCarthy as doing something very similar in wrestling with these questions as a lot of people in 20th century American literature and into the 21st? And how is he really different? And what do you think the most unique contribution is, I think particularly of his style, which you get into beautifully in the essay?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not as well read. I mean, I haven't read all of Pynchon and that kind of a thing. So this might be an incomplete answer. But I think he's certainly an American author. He couldn't have done what he had done had he been anything but a 20th century American. And some of that's because of the way that the landscape interacts with his characters and with his work. He's keenly aware of sort of the darker elements of the American story. And nobody gets out of his books or his historical consciousness unscathed. So he's definitely reckoning with the ugliness of American expansion. And that makes him very much of his time. His interest in science is actually, I think, akin to his interest in God, because I think some of what he doesn't seem to have a particularly high opinion of language's capacity to handle metaphysics, if that makes sense. So he seems to think that there's a lot language can't do. Many of his many of the passages in his books that seems like we're going to finally get to, oh, this is what we can say about God, or this is what we can say about existence. The characters will just stop. They'll just stop talking, and they had nothing else to say. And it seems like he almost thinks, especially you see this in The Passenger, where both of the main characters are brilliant physicists. Seems like he almost thinks that science can show us things about the nature of God that language, at least at this point in language's development, language just can't quite get us there. So that, I think, makes him pretty unique, to have a writer who writes so many books and also demonstrates some reservations about what language can and cannot do in relation to the most urgent questions of humanity. I think that's an interesting move on his part. Some of his choice to not really be part of a literary community was also probably temperamental. It doesn't seem like he enjoyed spending time with people who might be competitors or might criticize him. Obviously, I never met him, and but he seems like he was a pretty grouchy fellow. And it seems like he might have enjoyed being with folks who weren't weren't in his same sphere. And it seems like he relished that element, and he pretty rigorously avoided being part of a literary community, which is an interesting decision. So as for how he fits into the American literary landscape, I think he's definitely doing some Hemingway things. That's a pretty well-known connection. But I think he's doing Hemingway in a bigger, more biblical way. So he's trying to take that stripped downness and attach it to a mythic language. Like I talk about in the essay, he uses this poetic mythic meter and a lot of figures of speech that you find in the King James translation of the Bible and those sorts of things. So he's a myth maker, but he's a myth maker who doesn't really think that language is going to be able to encompass the realities that myth is getting at. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, that's very helpful.
Okay.
Jane, what I love about this essay is, I think, a similar reason that I've been drawn to McCarthy is that he's asking the right questions. And even if, I finish a novel and I think, I don't know if I can really do that again, I end up being, drawn back into another novel later on. And he's asking the right questions and grappling with kind of a real violence of the world. And you point out in the introduction how a lot of people kind of shy away from him because of that, right? They don't really find it palatable to read about the just kind of ongoing violence of the world. And what I appreciate about your answer, and maybe it's not an answer to his questions, maybe it's just more of a response, because a lot of the kind of questions that he offers up about the nature of the world maybe aren't fully answerable from even a perspective of faith, right? We aren't going to be fully able to answer the deepest suffering or some specific extreme examples of suffering that he brings up, even in kind of the best theodicy. So I'm wondering, kind of in your approach from a perspective of faith, you kind of offer some path forward that maybe he's not able to fully flesh out because of, as you mentioned, the limits of language. I'd love to kind of listeners to hear, what is some of your response as a person of faith to reading his work?
Well, I'm still trying to formulate one. I wrote this essay the month that marked the 1-year anniversary of my mom's death. So a lot of this was really, I don't know, I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. But I think you're at some point, faith is not a rational activity, and that doesn't denigrate faith. That doesn't mean that faith is irrational. It means it's super rational. Faith is a spiritual posture. It's not an intellectual exercise. And I think part of that spiritual posture is you have got to look at the world as it is. If you build up a spiritual posture of faith that's based on a fake picture of the world. So if you build a faith that's based on, oh, things turn out well for good people, or suffering always has a meaning that we can see, or even, well, God is always there, that's not going to work, because in real life, those things aren't true. Maybe God is always there, but not in any way that those words make sense, if that makes sense. I mean, if we say God is always there, then the words is and there mean something different than they mean in normal conversation. Because when you say someone is there, it indicates they're present and you can experience that. When we say God is there, his presence is complete. It's not contingent on our experience of his presence. And that's not how we use the word there in normal conversation. So you had to build your posture of faith based on reality, because if you don't, your faith is not, you're going to get shaken up. So I think Cormac McCarthy is doing us a spiritual service, honestly, by making us look at what is actually in the world. Because our faith has to be able to stand before those things and look at them. And we see this from Christ. Christ, when he saw poverty, when he saw sickness, when he saw death, he approached it and looked at it. He didn't immediately try to fix it. Sometimes he never fixed it. Sometimes he left people to die. Sometimes he left people sick. He left people blind. But he went and he looked at it. And Cormac is doing that, and he's making us do that. He's making us create a posture of faith that is in response to reality. You can't stop with Cormac. You have to go and read the Gospels after you read Cormac, and you have to go and read. I mean, you don't have to read the mystics, but I have to go and read St. John of the Cross. I have to go and read St. Hildegard. I have to go and read the mystics who have gone beyond. So I wouldn't ever recommend reading Cormac McCarthy and stopping. But I think you have to read something that, or if you don't read it, you have to go downtown in your city and see what's happening. Because your faith has got to be in response to what really is in the world, and not in response to some version of the world that you have created in your mind.
Yeah, you talked about kind of how Cormac talks about the presence of God, and maybe one way that he suggests how we experience the presence of God. He doesn't really fully explore this, but he suggests that it's kind of through other people, or at least the people who seem to have a faith that's deeper in his books. I think of Sunset Limited. You have Black and White, the two characters, one who just pulled the other off the tracks, right? And what's interesting is Black is the one who has maintained his faith, and he has experienced more true suffering than White.
Yeah.
And White has much more of this theoretical view of suffering and kind of the evils in the world, versus Black has actually experienced true suffering in his life, and maybe a lot of people would still describe his present life as suffering. But he says that he maintains his faith through service of others, service to others and love of others. And that's kind of how he maintains faith through suffering, is through this kind of social interaction, which a lot of McCarthy's characters could be described as antisocial in their behavior. So that's another interesting theme, along with violence tied to faith, is faith tied to kind of the social versus antisocial question.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I haven't thought about that much, but it does come to mind how Bobby Western in The Passenger is probably the most social leading character in a Cormac McCarthy novel. And he seems to the end, to me, and I know people have different readings on this, but it seems to me that he comes to a place where he is at least seeking faith. The line at the end where he says, "I don't pray for anything, I just pray." That is a faith movement where you've it seems to me that he has submitted to the reality that reality is beyond his comprehension, And he says, I don't even know what I should ask for because all of this is beyond me, but I know that I want to maintain some level of connection with reality. And at the end of the day, that's really what religion is. It's just we call reality God. And we want to maintain a connection with him, and we want to submit our expectations of reality to God and say, well, I thought my mom would live another 20 years. That's not what happened. So I'm going to just go and pray because it doesn't make sense to pray for what I want anymore because apparently that's not true. And I think Cormac McCarthy understands that difficulty and depicts it in a way that, to me at least, is actually oddly comforting. I'm not sure anyone has ever said that Cormac McCarthy is comforting, but I really do find his books comforting.
So there's an interesting question of where do we find comfort in a world of violence? And you've alluded to this a little bit earlier because, when you say that, after you read McCarthy, you have to go on to the Gospels. And you mention the life of Christ in some of those examples. But how you conclude your essay is actually with the crucifixion. And this is that place where comfort meets violence historically in the Christian faith. And I'm wondering how you see that in McCarthy, if you could unpack that. Is there a redemptive possibility of violence? And how does the cross help us think through these sort of realities that Cormac McCarthy brings so starkly into relief?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that Cormac McCarthy really openly wrestles with the cross much, except in that line in All the Pretty Horses where it says that in the Spaniard's heart there is a deep conviction that nothing can be proved except that it be made to bleed. Virgins, bulls, men, ultimately God himself. So the implication is because God could be made to bleed, he has been proved. He has been tested and found. He's been proved. He's been found true. It's one line from tens of thousands, but it means a lot that this woman says that, and nothing in the book goes on to rebut her. So I think that's the closest you're going to get in McCarthy. I'm sorry, the rest of the question was you wanted me to sort of reflect on the crucifixion?
Yeah, I'm wondering, you look at how, you beautifully sort of led us through sort of how the gospel helps you encounter the world that McCarthy presents in a way that does not lead to despair, but also does not lead to a sort of devalue and dismissal of the human experience. Just because of where you ended that, I thought this is a wonderful ending. This is a beautiful ending to an essay, but this is also a beautiful beginning to maybe a follow-up essay. And I'm wondering if you have any tentative thoughts as to how you would develop that sort of insight at the end into your own life and maybe even encouragement to others.
Yeah, that's kind of like work. I don't really have it done yet, but I think the most important thing that I'm doing in my life is that very thing of trying to understand how. It's not a rational activity, so it's difficult. It really is sort of a mystical thing to try to put yourself into a right relationship with suffering and grace. I don't know, because you end up with these two things that are both real. The reality is that God loves us and that we suffer a lot. And I don't think there's a calculus. That's a big point I wanted to make in this essay, is that I think sometimes our instinct is to try to create a calculus and say, well, we suffer a lot, but then when Jesus died on the cross, he suffered a lot too. So that balances it out. And I don't think that's helpful at all, because to simply pile suffering on suffering and then say that that somehow is a solution, that's not imaginatively satisfying. And theology has to be imaginatively satisfying, or it's not doing its job. So there's got to be some other reality of what happened at the crucifixion. It wasn't just, oh, God's going to come and suffer just as much as we did, and then it's going to be balanced. There's something else going on where suffering itself has entered the Godhead, that suffering is now part of. And I know this sounds so weird because we believe that God doesn't change, that his nature is immutable, and that's a dogma. However, the gospel shows us that at some point, Christ took on a human body, and that human body is now in heaven. It ascended into heaven. So there's mysteries here about what is happening within the Godhead and how suffering is becoming part of eternity and is becoming part of the eternal story of grace and of God himself. And it all sounds so odd, but I'm not making this stuff up. It's in Catholic dogma. But I think that we all have a responsibility for our own souls to accept that these things are deep mysteries and not try to reduce them to some kind of a calculus or a balancing act or something like that, but instead to, with our own suffering, somehow try to find a way to see violence as something that, because of the crucifixion, is part of the body of God. He has welcomed it into himself. I hope that doesn't sound too weird.
Oh, it sounds delightfully weird.
Okay.
I mean, this is part of, I mean, when you mentioned, there's, René Girard is a Catholic literary theorist, anthropologist.
Yeah, I love him.
he alludes to sort of this phenomena, and I think you're right saying that this is in some sense from the beginning. Girard has a famous interview with two, actually I think, psychologists entitled "Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World."
Yeah,
the idea that these things are providentially part of the total package. And that there is some sort of hope for reconciliation within that and through that.
Yeah, and I think that word hope is really important because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense rationally, but there is an imaginative space that, I mean, I'm not an accomplished mystic, but I do think there are moments where when you give up trying to balance all of this, you can have a sense of what is possible. And you see those moments in St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, in those saints who dedicated themselves to exploring these mysteries. You can see there is a path forward where you can be in the presence of suffering and be wounded by it and not be callous, and also the witness or the experience of that suffering deepens your love of God. And somehow those things can both be true together.
No, I liked how you had mentioned kind of being pulled back into Cormac McCarthy. Like I said, I've not read a lot of Cormac McCarthy. I started reading No Country for Old Men, which actually I had a similar experience with the film, which I remember going to see in the theater and walking out of it thinking that I hated it. That I just thought it had nothing to say. And I think it is that what we had talked about of what Jane had referred to as kind of the lack of a plot. That it, I think about this in the way of somebody explained it to me in a conversation about James R.R. Martin in Game of Thrones, or The Song of Ice and Fire, that you have these different approaches of the architect and the gardener when it comes to writing. And the architect knows exactly where the story is going. And as a result, the characters make choices in there that move the plot along to its final destination, even if they aren't necessarily the best reflection of the character that's been constructed, that it may seem out of character of sorts. They make decisions that move it towards the end. Whereas in, I think, Martin's writing, and I think in McCarthy's writing, at least as I can tell from like the film translation of it that I've seen, characters make decisions that are within their character, but it doesn't necessarily send us off in a specific direction towards some kind of a conclusion. I think we see this in other filmmakers as well. This has always been one of my kind of love and critique of Paul Thomas Anderson films, is that he tells stories. He doesn't really, there's not really a plot there. And as a result, there's often sections of the film that I think could be excised. Like, he doesn't know when to pull things out because it really doesn't add anything to the story. But that's how I kind of felt about No Country for Old Men the first time that I saw it. But I felt this desire to watch it again and meditate on it. And I think what the very important, we talked about this with Jonah Goldberg a couple weeks ago, where he likened it to the film, late 90s film, A Simple Plan, which the plot, quote unquote, is somewhat similar, that these people find money and they think that they can take it and without consequence. And we see it similar to Llewellyn's story in No Country for Old Men, that he makes this decision and it kind of rains hell down upon him. This is also one of the reasons why I think maybe McCarthy, I'd read this great book I've referenced on the show a number of times from Chuck Klosterman called But What If We're Wrong?, where it tries to get us to look at the present the way that we look at the past of 500 years ago, where we think, like, how could those people believe that the sun revolves around the earth? And we're going to be wrong about all kinds of things that won't be known until 500 years from now. But he has this question in there about what literature from this era will be remembered. And part of his answer is almost certainly nothing that is very popular in its time, because all the questions will have been asked and in most cases answered by the author as to what the work means. I'm wondering if McCarthy will stick around for the same reason of, as you point out in the essay, Jane, he kind of refused to talk about his work. Like, he wouldn't take honorariums. He wouldn't go give speeches about his work. He wouldn't really explain it. And you have this early on in the essay, you write, those critical of McCarthy's work generally form into two camps. The more pedestrian, who find McCarthy's writing simultaneously plotless, we said, and repulsive, and the more sophisticated, who believe McCarthy is running some kind of a sham, and that all his spiraling descriptions conceal the dark truth that he has nothing to say. I have greater sympathy with one of these camps with the other. So Jane, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about that. The last one there, which I presume is the one you have some sympathy with, as well as his writing style. His eschewing of punctuation, his use of and instead of commas to connect sentences together, which I think can perhaps makes it, even some of the quotes I read in the essay where you quote McCarthy, it makes it a little hard to parse. But as a result, I think, going back to the Klosterman point, it may be the kind of thing that people 100, 200, 300 years are still talking about because the answers aren't so obvious.
Yeah, I think that that stylistic thing you point out with the and, that it's one of my favorite figures of speech, and part of why I love it, it's called syndeton, and it's so divisive. People either absolutely love it or they hate it, and I think it's one of those. So for anyone who out there is a writer and wants to find a way to change up your sentences, just think about how you're using conjunctions, because nothing changes the feeling of a sentence in quite the same way as piling on conjunctions like that, or stripping them down, making every time that you use a conjunction, put in a period, just seeing how that changes your pacing and allows you to flex your voice. It's interesting. I'm curious to see if in the next 20 years we have a bit of an epidemic of this overuse of syndeton in American writing. And, because we're still weeding out the David Foster Wallace influence. And I wonder if we're going to have a whole crop of wannabe Cormac McCarthy's that we all have to tolerate for the next 20 years. That'll be interesting to see. But I mean, you don't really see that happening now. There's only a handful of people I'm aware of who are attempting to imitate his style or to integrate elements of it into their own work. So perhaps we will be spared that. But it is off-putting if you are used to reading more normal styles. It's off-putting to open it and see very little punctuation. I remember there's a story about he was proofing a draft and he sent it back to the publisher, and the only thing he had changed was he removed one comma. That was it. He was like, oh, there's one too many commas in my book. And as I was reading through all these, I remember there was one place where he used an apostrophe, and it hit me like a rock from a slingshot because I hadn't seen an apostrophe in weeks at this point, because all I'd been reading was Cormac McCarthy, and then all of a sudden there was one there because it changed the meaning of the word, so he had to include it. But it was so funny how it floored me after being, hundreds of pages deep into his world. I think he's doing those things just I would see it almost as a spiritual practice of stripping down and trying to eliminate clutter, because that's a lot of what he's doing is trying to identify what is essential. And so he takes the pretty radical step of eliminating punctuation that he finds unessential. It also gives kind of an unsophisticated gloss to his characters. When you see a contraction like don't without the apostrophe, it places the speaker, the character who says don't without an apostrophe, places him so far outside of any kind of intellectual or sophisticated cosmopolitan globalist world. And it makes everything feel kind of down home, which I think is important because McCarthy's characters tend to be pushing away from urban centers. And the exception here would be The Passenger, which is really a remarkable book. It undoes a lot of the structures that his other books use. So that one's really interesting. I could talk about that one for a whole podcast. So I think there's a lot of reasons why he does those things. It's sort of the classic, stylistically, you can do whatever you want as long as you get away with it. And some people think he gets away with it and some people don't. So that's half the fun of writing, is try something and just push it hard enough that it sells. And I think he sells it.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. And again, the essay is Blood of a Thousand Christs, The Violent Faith of Cormac McCarthy. It appears in the summer 2023 issue of our magazine, Religion and Liberty, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes. Jane, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. This was really fun.
Let's go now to our second topic, which is really three topics under one umbrella, and the umbrella of the Supreme Court. A couple of the major cases that were decided by the Supreme Court in the term that ended at the end of June. We'll deal with them in no particular order here. Probably the biggest one of the three was the affirmative action case that the court decided. This was actually two cases that was wrapped up into one. One was a lawsuit against Harvard. The other was a lawsuit against the University of North Carolina. They combined these cases into one. And as the Morning Dispatch here summarizes, justices were tasked with determining whether the race-based admissions policies at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina violate Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, and the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Excuse me, I believe that's Title VI. That's Title VI. Title VI, not 9. I can do Roman numerals. Believe me, I can. Writing for the 6-3 majority split along ideological lines, Chief Justice John Roberts concluded that they did, and that giving some students a race-based boost necessarily discriminates against others in the zero-sum world of admissions to highly selective colleges and universities. We saw this coming. At least most people saw this coming, not just because of the ideological makeup of the court, but because Roberts himself had written previously, the best way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And this is fundamentally his point about the affirmative action rubrics here. What do, feel free either one of you to jump in, what do you make of the significance of this decision?
So on the level of everyday students, this is not significant. Most colleges and universities in this country are not highly selective. Most colleges and universities in this country are very easy to get into, perhaps too easy to get into, to the tune that we have many students in this country that gain admittance and do not complete college, and they end up with sort of unconscionable levels of debt as a result. This is a very big deal.
Which we'll be discussing in a moment here.
Yes. This is a very big deal for students looking to get into elite universities. Universities that sit on very large endowments, that are selective by choice. These are schools that part of their prestige is their selectivity. And a lot of them have sought to sort of socially engineer what they believe is the ideal environment with the ideal sorts of people. Sorts of people based on academic performance, sorts of people based on sort of racial composition of the class. This has resulted particularly in invidious sort of racial discrimination against applicants of East Asian and South Asian origin. This does not, in fact, affect white students that much in the grand scheme of things. And if these policies are successfully, if these policies are successfully reversed, we should look at the Ivy Leagues getting much more East and South Asian as a result of this, both from applicants within the United States and internationally. These are very competitive institutions that literally everyone in the world wants to be a part of. The two largest nations on the planet, the three largest nations on the planet, are all East and South Asian nations, with China, Indonesia, and India. So this will affect things very much for those universities unless they take this as an opportunity to expand their institutions and serve more students. The less selective, the less of a pronounced effect this will have.
Yeah, there's one other thing I want to note, and again, none of us are lawyers, but the fact, this is also going to be true in the 303 creative case when we get to that in a few minutes. The fact pattern, particularly in the Harvard case, is just not the fact pattern that if you are Harvard, you want to be walking into the court with, because there was a lot of factual evidence that the way they were orienting the use of affirmative action and these procedures in their admissions was to say, like, kind of, we don't want to say no Asians, but we're kind of saying no Asians. It is not a fact pattern that you want to walk into the Supreme Court with. So if you were from the Harvard side of this, it's not even necessarily that you have that big of an interest in the outcome of this case, but like if this was the kind of thing that you may have wanted to get taken out of the court system before it got to the Supreme Court to give them the ability to rule on it, because the facts just did not make you look good.
Yeah, I think the discovery process was one of the most helpful parts of this case, right? Because you have a lot of elite colleges saying things like, this is just a beautiful ideal of having, college environment with people, balanced cohort of students. But then in the discovery process, you realized, oh, this is what it takes to get to that kind of nice sounding ideal is in the personal statements when they, wrote about students, hey, this is about kind of the je ne sais quoi of the unmeasurables about a student. They were just giving Asian students across the board lower personality scores. So according to Harvard, Asians just have on average worse personalities than the rest of the applicants, right?
Not great, Bob.
It sounds awful when you say it like that. And I think this forced Harvard to get that out in the open where they couldn't have an opaque system anymore. So I think going forward, there's this kind of competing ideal of saying, no, what if you'll still have a super diverse group of students going to Harvard at the end of the day. It'll look a little different, but there's still super talented students from all different backgrounds in the U.S., and they're going to end up there.
Yeah, to Dan's point earlier, and this is something that is true irrespective of the racial categories in which people fall into, but it has been true, and it has been documented and shown to be true that in some of the cases where affirmative action was used like this to pick specific racial minorities throughout the country and bring them into Harvard, in many cases, those people did not complete a degree at Harvard. They found it to be too challenging, which is not to say that they couldn't complete. Harvard is challenging. Like, it is part of the point of an Ivy League education that it is very challenging. I think this has also been a phenomenon more pronounced in places like MIT, where it's more rigorous sciences rather than, if you want to make the case that Harvard has been slacking off in its quality over the years. I'm not going to necessarily argue with that. But you bring in people that I think it is good. And I think there is merit to having people from different kinds of backgrounds in this bean counting-ish kind of way matriculating. I think that's probably a good thing. But you want to bring in people who are going to be set up for success at a university like that, and bringing in people who will struggle in order to meet your bean counting isn't a good look either, especially when it's perfectly reasonable those people could find other institutes of higher education that would better serve their interests and their needs. I do want to get both of you to weigh in, or either one of you if you want to weigh in on, because this was something else that was brought up in the conversation about this case. And I don't know that how much it applies from a legal perspective, because I don't know that there is anything kind of prima facie seemingly wrong about legacy admissions at elite universities like this, in the way that, the ruling in this case is that it violated the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. But how should we also think about legacy admissions? Because if you're thinking you're getting like lower quality people just for semi-arbitrary reasons, that does seem like a funnel of your people are getting a boost to getting in just because somebody, back from their family legacy went to the same university.
This is part of the question is what is university for? If university is for sorting students by intelligence, it's obviously against that. Now, there are institutions such as MIT that very much privilege test scores, admission requirements. There are other universities that privilege other things. Some universities privilege people from certain faith traditions. We have, for instance, in Grand Rapids, we have Calvin University. This is a university that the Christian Reformed Church here has a stake in. Students from that religious tradition receive a tuition discount at Calvin. You have, I think, legacy should part of what the university be to serve its alumni? And should part of that service be to serve those alumni through, by extension, serving their children? I don't think that's unreasonable. I don't think that the university has to be a sorting arrangement. I don't think, the American university needs to be a completely meritocratic institution. Now, I think there's a market for universities that operate on those principles as well. But I see no problem with a university seeking to foster intergenerational community through legacy admissions. And to cultivate alumni donor networks, because that's also what a big part of this is about. And we can talk about that cynically, but we can also talk about that in terms of listen, universities, particularly research universities, need to raise a lot of money to do academic programs. And one way to do that is to cultivate relationships with successful alumni.
Yeah, I think it's really a fundraising thing. So you have dad went to this college, and then when his son goes, he's much more likely to give. And with universities and colleges closing, I think that's a big thing that some kind of middle tier universities may double down on. Now, we may see kind of the elite tier of universities, which, as Dan mentioned, is only a small portion of the general higher ed space, I think we will see some of them dropping this legacy preference because they're going to be looking for any other ways to kind of get the class makeup that they can without using strict race-based policies. They're very risk averse, so they're going to try to follow this law to the T, but also they still, I think most institutions hold the same ideals they did before. So dropping legacy admissions could be one way of doing that.
Going from getting into college to now questions about paying for college, or at least the aftermath of financing college. One of the other decisions the Supreme Court handed down at the end of their term was to reject President Joe Biden's bid to cancel, and I put that in scare quotes, or forgive, also in scare quotes, about $430 billion in student loan debt. Now, the legal reason for this, and this has been one of these really frustrating post cases, this is often true in Supreme Court cases where I find myself repeating generally the same thing, that people is like, did you read the holding in the case? No, but I read things that other people wrote about the holding in the case, and I do not approve of the things that I read that other people wrote about the holding in the case. Go read the holding in the case. This is not to say that cancellation or forgiveness of student debt is a good idea or a bad idea. I have my opinions on that. But it is to say that the executive did not have the statutory authority to just do this. People have pointed out that it is far from a historical anomaly to see the forgiveness of different kinds of debt. I think it was a Washington Post piece about this that in the subhead acknowledged the elephant in the room, which is this has been done before. And they kind of just glossed over the part that they added, which is by legislatures. So again, I think the idea that if you took out student debt, and I do want to add the caveat of I find the culture that exists around later grade school into high school and the emphasis that was true when I was there, I imagine was probably true for both of you as well, that you graduate from high school and you go to college. Like that is just reinforced all along the line. And you know what? I don't know that that is a good culture to foist upon people, for people to be making these kinds of very expensive life-determining decisions at age 18, even if it's in consultation with their parents. But I'm generally the idea that if you take out debt, you need to pay it back. But if you want relief from this, and I'm even open to arguments about how bad the system is and that we should, on a very means-tested basis, entertain the idea of forgiving certain student debt. Maybe a better idea would to make a change to make it dischargeable in bankruptcy would be a better way to approach this. But if you want to do it, go to the legislature. Congress or state legislatures for the state university systems that they run can make these decisions. The executive cannot. And I don't really know how much merit this conversation has to having beyond making that point, at least with regard to what the Supreme Court did.
I mean, it's pretty transparent. Speaker Pelosi said this at the time that this was first floated, is that this needs to be a legislative initiative. Everybody knew this. The Biden administration sought to do it for political purposes. Nobody thought that this was, I mean, this is the sort of thing is, pundits can pretend around the edges about, and write opinion pieces about why this decision was bad because they think student loan debt should be canceled. But no one who knew anything at any point thought the court would uphold this decision. And there are very good reasons for that in terms of legal precedent, in terms of the makeup of the court, in terms of everything else. So when a president seeks to unilaterally do things that everyone believes before he does them, including probably the president himself, is probably going to be found unconstitutional. That's just a failure of leadership. This is something that can be done by legislators, and legislators can organize and begin to try to build coalitions to get something like this through the legislature tomorrow. on its merits. But this is a very open and shut case that exists entirely apart of the larger debate about student debts.
There's a whole political issue hanging around the legal issue, which Chief Justice Roberts said it's a pretty open and shut case about federal powers, and that's kind of
again. I challenge anybody to read Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in this case. If you really think that the HEROES Act, which was passed in the wake of 9/11 and the deploying of military to Afghanistan and Iraq, somehow gives the power to the President of the United States using the excuse of a global pandemic to forgive a whole bunch of student loan debt. I mean, this to me actually does cut to one of the fundamental arguments that exists right now about the law, which is I remember seeing Justice Thomas talk about his memoir a number of years ago, where somebody asked a question about his way of interpreting the law and the Constitution. He says, well, I think there's two ways that you can do it. There's the way that I approach it, which is to understand what it meant at the time and what the text means, and to have that inform the decision that you make on it. And then he stopped talking, and the person asked, well, what's the other way? He's like, or you can just make it up.
Yeah, and I think there's the political conversation hanging around it is, this is a win for Biden in the sense that he can say that he did something about it, but he doesn't have to actually have the consequences of it actually passing through.
And he can blame the Supreme Court for why it didn't actually happen.
Exactly. If this did go through legislature, we'd have to have the conversation that I think needs to happen, which is, okay, we can talk about loan forgiveness, and I think that's a good conversation to have. But in addressing the kind of the debt load that students have, we also have to address how we got here and try to fix some of that. And I mean, it's easy loans that got us to where we are right now. And there's an argument to be made that was unfair to students, so we should address their debt load. But we have to address how we got here.
Well, and bringing our perspective on the economics of all of this to bear here, too, that it was the easy debt that was paid out to these universities that is also a huge culprit in inflating the cost of tuition and room and board and everything else for these universities that has made them more expensive. And Noah, you make a fantastic point that for anybody who wants to seriously engage in this kind of a conversation about debt forgiveness, and again, I'm open to this debate. I do want to find a way to means test out people who are, a lot of this debt is being held by people with graduate degrees.
You have to answer the doctor and lawyer question.
Exactly. Should we be forgiving a whole lot of debt of people who are going to go on in almost all cases to be very high earners? But if you're not talking about pairing something like this with subsequent action, legislative action to address what created the problem in the first place, I don't regard you as being all that serious about this, and probably just practicing a more venal form of politics here, which I think we probably all agree was what was really at play with Joe Biden's effort here.
One of the wonderful stories that not many Americans know today is that we have seen now for several years, year over year, decreases in tuition on average and decreases on the cost of higher education. One of the reasons for that is people are changing behavior patterns. They're starting to learn, they're starting to think through, man, do I really want to take on this level of debt for an uncertain payout at the end? And that behavior is changing, and that's a welcome thing. And that is resulting in college being more affordable for everyone for the first time in a very long time in this country. And one of the biggest mistakes you can make in economics is when you have problems with costs is to subsidize demand. And this is what student loans are, and this is what the discharge of student loans would be. If you were, this creates one of and I'll look this up and we'll get it in the show notes, but one of the interesting things you saw with the student loan interest payment pause, which is something that did happen through much of the pandemic, is a lot of those folks took out more education loans. They used that opportunity of no accrual of interest to leverage themselves further. Now, in an individual case, maybe that was the right decision. But when that starts showing up in aggregate numbers, that tells me even this interest pause for the pandemic subsidized demand in a way that nobody anticipated. And I think we would see a great deal more of that if these loans were to be forgiven, dismissed, rescinded, whatever language we want to use.
And see, this is where I keep coming back to the cultural point of all of this. You know, I've got a almost 13-year-old at home, and it was amazing. When we were in Chicago, even as early as like first and second grade, they had a day where all of their teachers wore a T-shirt or a sweatshirt from whatever university they went to. And there was just such a focus on this being the one and only path. And, you know, from a data perspective, to a certain extent, that's kind of undeniable, right? I have the same questions about this that I do about like the Brookings success sequence kind of stuff, which is, I don't know how prescriptive it actually is. Like if you follow this as a pattern, if you're going to end up, you know, successful or largely successful, or at least not in poverty, I imagine there's probably some truth to that, but I haven't really seen a whole lot of reckoning with what does this say? Is it just kind of a self-selection problem, right? Where it's like the kind of people who are unlikely to end up in, you know, poverty are the kind of people who will do those kinds of things. So I don't know which way it necessarily goes, but you know, the idea that a bachelor's degree is a guarantor of, you know, greater amount of income throughout your life, the numbers bear that out. But I think we would do well. And this is the kind of thing that, again, I understand that especially a lot of our new right friends get very frustrated at this kind of talk. But legislatively, I don't know how much you can affect that cultural idea that insists upon students from an earlier and earlier point in time that you go to grade school, you go to high school, and then you go to college. Like with my kids, I'm perfectly fine. Like take a year. Figure out what you want to do. I have a degree in music business. Do you know what I don't use on a daily basis? My degree in music business. So the idea that you should be making these major choices at that point in time in your life just because it's the expectation of what you do next doesn't seem like that great of an idea to me. And I wish we'd pull back off the cultural pressure side. I think we would probably begin to see some good results from that. But again, this is a whole mess, and there are the elements that need to be dealt with legislatively if we're going to address them.
Great way to start that is to stop subsidizing demand.
That's invoking John Roberts in a way here. The best way to stop subsidizing demand is to stop subsidizing demand. I am going to go ahead and table the 303 creative story. We'll talk about that on this program next week so that we can actually give it its full time since we have gone long today. So let's call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look right now in the show notes for a link to where you can subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or just search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find this show. Thanks to Dan, thanks to Noah, and a special thanks to Jane Clark Scharl for joining us. For the Acton Institute, I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.